and with that mixture inside.
Should you know everything?
This is such a haunting film, and at the same time, it's a very real film because it's about experiences that millions of people are having every day. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the area that it's shot in and just what the genesis of the project was.
So it's not really shot in one location or one area. And the idea is for me not to tell you exactly the locations, but to really take you through various states of minds rather. And if I was to clear that, basically my friend Yashu and me had kind of worked on a project many years ago on looking at workers building the metro in Bangalore. And that was mostly shot and kind of we spoke very closely to the workers and kind of got their personal experiences and their kind of stories of longing in the context of them being far away from home. Because most people who come to cities to build any infrastructure are not from the cities. So for me, some of those questions, and after the films were finished, I felt like there was a lot of questions in my mind, and I felt like I had to kind of go back to some of the families of the workers who had become close friends by then, to kind of revisit what really the meaning of longing and the meaning of being away from home, or also what the process of forgetting someone after they've left really meant. So I kind of traveled to various different parts of the country, trying to meet people who were still somewhat in touch. Some of them have lost touch with the workers and what really was going on back home in that sense. And also not divorce it completely from what's happening in between these proximities.
Yeah, that's just the word that comes to mind, in between. It seems like a lot of this movie takes place in an in-between space. We're not seeing the people who are back home a little, and we're not seeing what's happening in the cities either. It's about a mood. It's about this in-between mood, which can be a pretty melancholy, sad place, really.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the film is called Birha. And actually, I would say there is no English translation for this word. Absence, I think, really kind of limits the meaning of the word itself. There are many meanings of Birha, and different traditions of poetry and literature in the country take different forms of the word itself. So in this context, I'm particularly referring to Birha as a state of being in this process of lamenting, longing, experiencing this pain, sometimes overcoming it, sometimes not fully being able to overcome it, waiting. So it's a combination of various different emotions. And so, for example, there are poets who have, there's an entire tradition called Birha poetry, which is what the film is in some ways inspired by. So it is in some sense trying to work out this state of really being so intimately connected to something, and also slowly, gradually having to let it go.
And this poetry, does any of the text of this poetry, is that spoken at any point, or is that, yeah?
It isn't directly spoken. It's first of all in a language called Multani Punjabi, which is then I had to kind of get a few of the poems translated. After which, for me, reading those poems kind of, and just taking the poems taking place in my own self, allowed me to listen to the people that I was meeting also quite differently. It informed me in a different sense. So there is one poem which kind of comes out in the film, which is the last sequence of the woman who walks into the mist and eventually disappears into the mist, and her kind of encounter with the dogs. That's a poem called Nuran, which again for me, it doesn't matter if the audience knows if it's a Batalvi poem or if it's Nuran, but in some sense speaks or is an extension to what all the people in the film are feeling and experiencing in some ways. So they're kind of bouncing off one another. And she is basically in the poem itself, I kind of had read it and I kind of dreamt it. And then I shot it kind of exactly like my dream. That's
It feels like a sort of dream, yeah. I mean, it's. I asked whether any poetry was spoken in the film because at times when people are talking, I mean, they're talking poetry, you know, especially, and sometimes a very strong, like kind of powerful poetry, like the woman who talks about, you know, ability, tolerance. You know, you'll never have that. You'll be torn in half like a cucumber. I mean, you should write that down. Put it in, put it in another movie, you know, as well.
no, that's just how people speak. People speak in verse. People speak in most of the languages. As especially in this project, I could hear many languages, and I met a lot of people listening to different dialects. It is actually quite intense and actually pretty poetic also. And these are not. These weren't phrases that we had planned in advance. It was just how. That's how Pooja speaks. Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. In terms of planning, I mean, I noticed in the credits you list some people as actors or at playing particular roles. Could you explain what that means?
Yeah. So in some sense, the film also for me, because I wanted to accentuate the whole mindscapes rather of various people that I'd met, because the idea was not to really talk about their current condition of like life in that sense. Like I wasn't getting into the socio-economic political space in a direct way, but the idea was to actually fictionalize some of the sequences. So some of the sequences are fictionalized to aid and support and kind of also work in sync with what I had heard from people. So it wasn't really following a very, like, even when I was doing my research, there were really long conversations and it wasn't really necessarily interview driven. It was really spending a lot of time in the everydayness of how they lived. And the actors really come to, I suppose, enhance this idea of birha, to really hold the real, and also not really distinguish as real and unreal, because suddenly in my head most of it has already started to blur. Whether like a lot of times, like the way we dream or the way we imagine things are so real, and then a lot of times when it's the other way around. So I really feel that the actors came on board to also as parts of very long conversations and not very far away from the. It was not like I had to literally talk to them about, okay, this is what I need you for, but these were also long conversations with them about what I was trying to do and whether it meets with some of the preoccupations that they had in their own lives. So in some sense, I would say it's all real.
Yeah,
And
sure.
she-
No,
yeah.
we don't need to make distinctions here. I mean, dreams are expressions of emotions, so they're emotions. I mean, one thing that interests me is that these are very complicated emotions too. You know, in the sense that, I mean, there's the feeling of you're sad. You know, a mother is sad because the son has gone to the city. But I started thinking about what's the situation there actually. You know, because the son maybe can't contact the mother or maybe doesn't want to contact the mother. So there are any number of scenarios that could be going on there, and how people react to it in different ways is also very interesting.
That's exactly why I didn't want to get into defining a specific grandmother or a specific. For me, it's really like actually depicts actually a collective of different people who are experiencing similar kinds of things and are finding different ways to grapple with it. So in the situation of the Dadi, the grandmother, it's actually pretty complex because, for example, two of her sons have actually disappeared. We don't know if this was. I mean, this is also specific to the location in that sense, but. Two of the sons have disappeared. Some of them have. Her husband was kind of murdered over a land conflict in Punjab, and at the same time, one of her sons has really not proven to be like he's not really being the son that she would like him to be. So he's also on a mode of like really exiting, but there's a very strong bond between them. And there's a lot of tension in that relationship as we speak because of various kinds of turbulences as life goes on. So in many ways, and in the village itself, I met quite a lot of people. Also, the photographs that you see in the beginning, they're of various different people who've kind of either gone missing, and one doesn't know if the missing person's dead or alive. And so there's also then this ritual, I think, of waiting and to always hope that there might be a chance that he will come back, he might return. And we can't really tell at which moment does someone contemplate if he's dead or and that's the kind of tricky space. So I just feel that the whole point was to kind of stay with her when she really went into deep sleep, and there were many moments when she would break out, and I'm not going to question or ask her like exactly what's happening, just making sure that just listening to her go through those sometimes sleepless nights, sometimes a kind of her own way of making meaning of various different things that have happened in her life. And it's a really quiet, and that's why I say it's for me quite impenetrable. I'm not, I don't think it's my place to kind of really go beyond this point. So I feel that silence and this kind of meditative ritual of like everyday life itself, of how she lives her life, it's pretty quiet, and I feel she has found her own way of, I think, grapple with different forms of loss and her will to live as well.
Because I mean, it makes so much sense because things are not always neat. You know, you don't always have the closure, and in that sense, this film makes a really potent counter narrative to what we hear a lot of or read a lot of. I mean, even just thinking of kind of traditional films about people go to the city and then they have a career and this or that happens and they write letters back. You don't have that here. This is very much a counter narrative to that.
It is because even with the women, most of the times, on trucks in back home, there's always this message of the woman who's like waiting in her sari and waiting for her husband to come back. There's a lot of poetry and music and lots of different expressions, let's say, of this woman always waiting for this man to return. And to my surprise, I found I wasn't necessarily surprised, but there were some moments where I'd seen that women had also, because they know once he's left, it's not going to be the same person who comes back. Even if he does, he's not coming back as the same person. Many cases there really aren't relationships to begin with, and even if they were, there are these desires that are growing and somehow burn out by virtue of living life itself. And in a way, I feel that it just opened my own idea of like what it is to like make sense of someone exiting and feeling this moment of detachment, and how does one come to terms with it. So for some, they will forget. For some, they've moved on, they're in other relationships. For some people, they believe they're sexual beings and that they should assert their sexuality irrespective of all of the conservative frameworks in which women must adhere to or whatever. So there are different ways, I think, that people kind of find their ways, and some people have drowned, some people, so there are different things. So for me, it was not important to kind of really specifically speak about a particular instance, because I do think in some sense it's also a reflection of myself in terms of how I've been grappling with different forms of loss and what my reactions have been to letting go itself.
Yeah. I mean, that comes out so powerfully in the kind of recurring motif of ghosts or ghostliness. And it almost seems a bit like you have like a gothic kind of thing, when you have the lightning that suddenly illuminates the painting of someone who's gone. It seems like you're drawing on a vocabulary of almost like not a horror film, but a kind of mystery environment.
Yeah. Definitely, because I feel that for me, there's an interplay between people living, the missing person, and the dead. I think it's there are moments when I actually think it's the same being in some sense. And with the ghost, I mean, apart from being personally fascinated and interested in ghosts and ghostly figures, I feel that I think in the film one is trying to constantly look at the ghost as also a witness to everything that's happening. And for me, ghosts are in trees. For me, ghosts are in the sound of very rainy night. They're there, and I feel that they're witnessing all of this. And even the moon, for example, actually that's something I got from Batalvi. There's a very, very beautiful poem called Shisho, where he describes the 14 cycles of the moon. And essentially, the moon is a witness to this kind of absurd and violent kind of injustice that's played out between a family and a landlord, essentially. And of course, there's various forms of exploitations that take place, but the moon is always rising and watching upon these things. And on the last day when it's fully formed, is so ashamed, as he writes, that so ashamed that he actually disappears. So or falls down, or is really ashamed and is unable to anymore witness anything more or do anything about it. So it's like a kind of a passive witness, but has seen everything, and now what do you do with this?
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's great. I wanted to ask about those shots. I mean, that particular shot where she's applying and the moon is there. That's all one shot, or it's not a composite, or it's you. I mean, sorry, you don't have to give it away, but
No, I mean,
it's
it
a
is.
beautiful image.
Yeah. No, I mean, of course, it's shot, of course, in different locations and different times. And the idea was to kind of really fictionalize this bit, although it turns out that the woman who is that we see dressing up was also riddled by the same question, because we had to explain to her what we were trying to do. And this kind of stems from one night when I had spent a night with one of the workers' wives, and it was just we just landed up, and he said, "I'll come back in an hour or something," and he didn't really talk to her, and he was seeing her after a year, I think. And it was a mixed, I don't know what she was feeling. First of all, she was wondering, like, who am I? Because she's like, okay, so there's this new girl now. At the same time, she just told me that she kind of asked me to help her dress up, and I couldn't really follow what was happening. And then after which we had cooked dinner, we ate, and she's like, okay, he hasn't come. And then she went back and started to really like dress up. And after which it was like I think 1 a.m. And then she's like, Ekta, can you call him? And I did, and he didn't answer the phone, of course. And eventually, as the night passed, I think her makeup started to wear off, and she was so tired of, I think, whatever. And then gradually, she just, I remember her waking up at very late and just removing her earrings and then just going to sleep. The morning came, he came back, and he's like, okay, let's go. And I mean, that kind of really stayed with me. And anyway, in the context of the film, the whole, what I'm trying to also evoke, I think, is that I think there's a performance also of being in a relationship, right? And this performance takes place, and one doesn't know really when something has shifted. And I think that we were trying to work out a sequence where it was different stages of being prepared, being ready, holding on to, and at the same time also saying, I'd like to leave it open ended in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I did think a bit about performance, just in all the various people talking in voiceover, and the man in the son who's with this little robot thing. I began to think of him as the sleeper. You know, just because he just seems he's put himself apart. He's told himself he has this life that he this is what he does naturally, and I don't know. It just feels like he's embraced something about that the lifestyle he has, but I can't tell if he's actually content or happy. Really, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say about that. I think we're sort of running a long time, but I just wanted to ask about the technical aspects of the film because you look at the credits and you realize how much you crafted like all the different aspects of it. So could you talk a bit about the sound design, for example, and how you assembled that?
It was a really complicated process because this film was especially in the production phase. I was really struggling with lack of resources because I didn't have a mic and I couldn't afford to get a sound recordist on board, and then I had to kind of figure out ways of also being aware of a lot of the sounds that we have are from we needed location sound, and especially some of the interviews that we got, etc. So most of that was done, and I spent a long time trying to log it because just there were many moments where we were not doing sync sound, right? So while there was the camera people were on shooting, I would be elsewhere because, for example, most of these locations are very noisy. So Punjab, for example, where the quietest sequences in the film are the most noisy locations because Punjab is really noisy. You have tractors, you have the Gurudwara chants, you have announcements, you have a lot of music also. So it's very, very difficult sometimes to really wait for a very quiet moment when you can hear the chant, which means you have to wake up at basically you have to wake up at wee hours to catch that moment in silence, right? Whether it's getting the dewdrops or whether it is trying to because most of the sounds I realized after coming back I couldn't use it because even though the sound of, let's say, the birds would be foregrounded, I would always hear the tractor. So, and there's no way you can kind of fix that, isolate that. So, so one had to keep going back to these locations specifically for recording sounds. And I would say that the second layer was also my friend who introduced me to an open archive of insects, and I spent a lot of time listening to cicadas, and I just feel it's a fully new world. Like I feel I could stay in this archive forever, and I mean I still feel I haven't scratched the surface, and it's unbelievable how electronic they can sound and how at the same time how sometimes it's hard to distinguish if this is really like how multiple cicadas can create this very, very eerie kind of feeling, and I try to listen to it at different times of the day and night, etc. So fun experiments in just listening. And then eventually there was of course some music tracks which I are connected to the I think the narrative of the film as well, and I felt that could enhance the mood in some ways, and I think my sound designer kind of really worked to stay with how do you build silence and how do you still stay in this mode of keeping it together, because in some sense it is a fragmented narrative, but it's still I feel comes
has the
together.
continuity of the kind of
yeah.
soundscape. I mean, in that sense, the sound we're hearing is more of like an interiority
Exactly.
kind of sound. Yeah. I'm just curious, what is the bird that sounds like an owl a bit? That's like what kind of bird is that?
Which
What is-
bird?
I don't
There are
want
many
to. Am I going to
birds in
imitate
my
the
film.
bird? I guess I'm going to do it. But
There are some gibbons.
gibbons. Oh,
Yeah,
you
there
mean
is,
like the monkeys? Or?
Yeah, the monkeys.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, there are some gibbons, but there's also I think that we. Are you talking about the whistling bird? We have to listen to the film specifically for this.
I can't do bird calls.
Most of them
it's
are
beyond my
cicadas.
skill set. I'm sorry. But it's just one. I was just curious what that one is. But I think we'll wrap up shortly. But I'm very curious. What's your next project that you're going to do in terms of filmmaking?
I still have. I can do this. This is actually a book that I put together of
Great.
all of Patalvi's poems that I translated. I'll give it to you before I leave.
Thank you.
But for me, it's really for me, each of these poems are films in a way, and I feel because he writes in metaphors, and it really speaks to the continuity from here on. And as you saw, there's one line in my credit which says, "There's a truck driver it was a missing sequence, and a cat crossed our path, and we couldn't shoot that sequence because he's like, something terrible is going to happen, and well, the truck broke down. So we haven't been able to shoot that. So I want to kind of go back and look at this idea of the road and how the road and his relationship, because his companion, he says, is the road now, doesn't want to go back home. But there's many other things that are opening up for me on the road, on the highways. And so somewhere between the village and the city.
Very intriguing. So a
Yeah.
road movie.
Maybe.
I'm kidding. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you.
been wonderful.
Thank you very much.